All right, as we are sharing this is for our Wednesday night class. Appreciate everyone joining us. We will be studying Exodus 23 in just a moment. As soon as we get this everywhere it needs to go, I appreciate everyone joining us here tonight and being with us as we study the book of Exodus. And as we continue to look at this book, we will see some great lessons we can learn. And we will continue studying about the covenant. You remember we talked about last week, in the last few weeks actually, about being in the covenant and looking at the covenant language that is given and that is discussed. And so this is where we're going to be tonight as we progress forward. All right, looks like we are everywhere we're supposed to be. So let me close out these extra windows. All right, I think we're where we need to be now. So now I can go back here and I can go back to this big screen. Uh-oh. Sorry, I just keep hitting the wrong button. Can't get going where I need to go. There we go. All right, now we're here. We should have everything ready and everything good to go now. So we're looking here at the book of Exodus. We're looking at, as I said, chapter 23, beginning in chapter 20. We saw the 10 commandments that were given. Then we started that idea of the covenant there of God asking the people, do you accept the covenant? Are you going to listen? Are you going to obey? And remember, the people said Moses they would, but they told Moses that God scares us, that God makes us afraid, that you go up on the mountain and talk to God. And so Moses gets this covenant from God. We've talked about some of the laws that have been given in the last few chapters, chapter 21 and 22, have been about that law. And we're going to see again, chapter 23 is sort of the end of that beginning the law language. And I say beginning because next week we're going to take a break from the law, and that we're going to see the covenant is ratified. The Israelites are going to have to take some steps to say they agree with the covenant, that they accept the covenant, and then we're going to start back in 25 to see the rest of the law picked up. And I told you that we'll eventually get where we'll cover more than a chapter a week. That's going to be a little later. Once we get to like the tabernacle, because there's a lot of details we won't have to look at in tabernacle, just to get a basic overview of what the tabernacle was like. So we are getting to where we're going to try to cover more than one chapter a week, but we're not there yet. That's what I'm trying to say. So we begin in chapter 23. And again, we're looking at this, breaking this down into laws. These laws are laws that are given to the people in order to flesh out the 10 commandments that are continuing to give more detail about what is happening. And so that's where we begin. And we begin here by speaking about the Israelites dealing with a fair witness, being a good witness, being a good upstanding citizen. One of those first four, think about first 4 or 5 verses, and we'll talk about them. It says, you shall not spread a false report. You shall not join hands with a wicked man to be a malicious witness. You shall not fall in with the many to do evil, nor shall you bear witness in a lawsuit, siding with the many so as to pervert justice. Nor shall you be partial to a poor man in his lawsuit. But just first 3 verses talk about this. Notice what God lays out. Again, God lays out these you shall and you shall not. And he begins here with some you shall nots, telling Israel how they're supposed to live. And this falls underneath that commandment, believe not the commandment, not to bear false witness. He says you shall not spread a false report. You're not going to give a false witness. Let what you say be true. And again, remember, in a time that this was, in the time of the wilderness, the time of the ancient world, their court cases, their laws, their justice system depended upon the witnesses. There wasn't, we like watching TV shows nowadays. We talked about it before. We like watching shows on TV of used to be CSI and NCIS. and all these crime shows where they go in and they find all this evidence, and they have all these little things that connect these people to their deeds, and it gets the bad guy in the end because the evidence connects all the dots. In the ancient world, you didn't have that. You didn't have that kind of technology to go through and find that evidence and be able to talk. Again, there was no such thing as, or no understanding of DNA and fingerprints and so forth and so on. So the way you had to prove a case, the way you had to prosecute a case, was to base it upon witnesses. And so it was very key for a justice system that is based upon witnesses to be fair, to be just, to be what it's called to be. They had to have it had to have people who were upstanding and people who were willing to make a right judge, a right witness. And this is what God's saying here. He says, one, you shall not spread a false report. You're not tell something didn't happen. Then it says, don't join hands with a wicked man. Don't join forces with those who are trying to do evil and trying to besmirch another man's name. Of trying to bear witness so that you gain to bear witness in someone else's downfall so that you get something out of it, is basically what this was. And then he says, not only are you to do that, you're to be careful not to fall in with the crowd. Don't go with the people just because the people say or think one thing, but you know something else because of your witness to be true and that thing to be false. Don't side with the many. Again, notice, don't side with the many so as to pervert justice. Instead, side with truth. And then verse 3, again, you shall not be partial to a poor man. And that's a big one there in verse 3, because typically in a lawsuit case, when someone's being partial to someone, it's usually a rich man. Because the rich man, again, we always talk about it, even in our world today, the rich man can pay and get out of punishment a lot easier than a poor man can. But God says, not only are you not supposed to favor the rich, but don't favor the poor either. Just because there's a poor man involved doesn't mean you give him the benefit of the doubt. And I think what this is this is calling for equality. It's calling for viewing all men the same, whether he's rich, whether he's poor, whether he's medium, what we call mid-class, middle class, however you want to break it down. He says, don't show favoritism. And again, the problem with this is to show favoritism is to pervert justice. Because if you show favoritism to someone, then you're going to side with them, whether they're right or whether they're wrong. And God says, don't do that. When you bear witness, when you have a case, he says, whatever part you're involved in, he says that here, especially as a witness, he says, do your best to be a witness that is fair and that is just. And then he continues on with his mindset in the next few verses, but not exactly in that idea, in that he tells them how they should react to the people around them. Notice, if you meet your enemy's ox or his donkey going astray, you shall bring it back to him. If you see the donkey of the one who hates you lying under his burden, you shall refrain from leaving him with it. You shall rescue it with him. So notice this idea. He says, if you meet your enemy, and the idea here of enemy seems to be the idea not of an enemy as a war enemy, but as an enemy, as someone you're in a confrontation with in a lawsuit, someone you're at ends with, that you're not agreeing with on some things. And he says, if you meet their ox or you meet their donkey, what they're going to depend upon and what they need to survive, and you see that ox or donkey wandering, instead of being like everyone else and saying, hey, there goes this donkey, he can't work today, that's a good thing, he's going to lose money, he's been so mean and evil to me, it's just going to cost him and he deserves that. God says, no, don't do that. He said, instead, if you see his donkey or his ox wandering away, he said, get that donkey and take it back to him. Because although you may not be in agreement with him, he says you still need to take care of him. You still need to treat him like your brother. You still need to treat him like your neighbor. And this is sort of where this law comes in of love your neighbor as yourself. And then not only that, he says, if you see the donkey of the one and he's under a heavy load, he says, you see him under a heavy load where he's falling down beneath the load. He says, you don't just leave the donkey there. He says, instead, you help unload the donkey. You help remove the burden from him. Then notice, you shall rescue it with him. Talking about your enemy. You're to work together to ease the load off this donkey so that he can carry it the rest of the way. And what this is doing is what God does is God sets up a very interesting thing here, not into the sense that some people are taking it today, but there is a general kindness that we're to have not only to all men, but also to all animals. Now, God does not put an animal equal with a man, but he does show that we are to, as we can, show concern for the animal. Because those here, this is his ox or donkey. His ox or donkey wanders astray. If he wanders out in the wilderness, then there's wild animals, there's bears, there's lions that can attack it and kill it. You're not to do that. Or you see again, the donkey under a burden, under a big load. That donkey is exhausted. That donkey is not able to carry on. You're not just leave that donkey there to die, but you're to ease that donkey's load. And this is again is a interesting side about this law. And we're going to see some other places where you take care of your enemy's possessions and you take care of the animals. They're not to be just mistreated. And that goes back to where we talked about last week. I've talked about how some people have problems with the slavery in the Bible. And that is the idea that if you're supposed to treat an animal this way, how much more are you supposed to treat a slave? And so a lot of people, again, have that idea that animals and slaves are just a tool. They're just something we work with, that we treat them just like a shovel, and we don't do that. We have a certain respect for them. We have a care for them. Again, they're not equal. Animals are not equal to human life, like some people today try to make it to be, but they are to be respected. They are to be taken care of as we can. We go from there to verse 6, and we get back to, again, the justice. And the idea is that if in verse 4 and 5, if you are willing to take care of their animal of your enemy, one who's at odds with you, then you're willing to be the good witness. You're willing to be the good citizen. And then you see verse 6 through 8. He says, "You shall not pervert the justice due to your poor in his lawsuit. Keep far from a false charge, and do not kill the innocent and righteous, for I will not acquit the wicked. You shall take no bribe, for a bribe blinds the clear-sighted and subverts the cause of those who are in the right." Now, this are laws geared more to the judge. Earlier, it was to the witness. This is to the judge. The middle part, verse 4 and 5, was to the person in the lawsuit, the prosecutor or the defense. And here, verse 6 and following is to the judge. This is what you should do. Again, don't pervert justice because it's poor. Just because he's a poor man doesn't mean he gets special treatment. Just because he's a poor man doesn't mean you excuse his behavior. You overlook him. Now, that's not to say that there's not some mercy, but the idea is you don't show over favoritism, that if he's guilty, he's guilty. There is no doubt there. And then verse 7, keep away from a false charge. If you have an idea, you think this is a false witness, a false charge, don't fall into it. Avoid it. And if you know it's false, don't just go with what the people want you to say. Don't go with what your friends want you to do. And again, he says, do not kill the innocent and righteous. The idea is don't condemn them. And not just don't condemn them to death, but don't condemn them of a wrong in such a way that it costs them their life. And again, I think the life here is not just, or to kill them is not just physically, but probably more than that, to cost them their living because of a lawsuit. Certain people, they had to pay a big lawsuit or had to pay something that they didn't do, they didn't owe, it could cripple them. And God says, don't mistreat them. It could lead again to their physical death, and it would include that physical death. And God says, I will not acquit the wicked. God says, I won't forgive them. I will not let the wicked off with easy charge. I will hold them accountable. And then he talks about the bribe. Don't take a bribe. He said, for a bribe blinds the clear-sighted and subverts the cause of those who are right. He says, basically, the only people who are going to give you a bribe are people who are in the wrong. If they have to give you a bribe, then they're already in the wrong. He says, don't side with them. Don't listen to their idea. Because if you take a bribe, he says it's going to make you it's going to muddy up the waters, if you will. Where you ought to see a clear case, a clear decision, the bribe is going to muddy that, and you're going to want to side with the one who gives you money. And so again, God says for this, again, the idea is for this justice system, these judges to work, they have to be upright, they have to be honest, they have to be pure. And this is true then and true today. Man, how many times we've made comments about a dirty lawyer or a dirty judge or bad witnesses, that kind of thing. And we talk about that the system is flawed because of what allows to happen. This is what God is trying to prevent. And this is something that they had just as much as we had, and even more so in their world, because the witnesses, the judge was such a major important part. And so God wants Moses and the Israelites to realize that a lawsuit is not something to be taken frivolously, and it's something to be done with great care and to make sure the best action, the the best way forward, best path is taken in figuring out what to do. Then verse 9 carries along the same idea of the justice. You shall not oppress a sojourner. You know the heart of a sojourner, for you are sojourners in the land of Egypt. Again, don't oppress a sojourner. Don't go after him because he's a foreigner. And again, the idea here is, like I said last week, that idea that this is a man who's not from here. This is a man who's not from Israel. He's not an Israelite. Therefore, people can gang up on him, especially in their world, where you take away, you think about our world, you take away transportation like we have, take away phone, internet, take away all that communication, and you have someone who's even 10 miles from their home, they have no hope of getting any help. Even 5 miles would be hard to get help. And so they're up to how the neighboring people are going to treat them. And God says, don't oppress the soldier. Just because he's a foreigner doesn't mean you take advantage of him. You're treating him like he's one of yours. He says, because you know what a soldier is like. You know what it's like to be taken advantage of when you're a foreigner. And he reminds them of Egypt. And so what we see here in these first 9 verses is God laying out how the justice system is to work. How the justice system is based on fairness, is based on equality, that all people are supposed to be treated the same, whether rich, whether poor, whether a national or a foreigner, whatever they are. Justice should be the number one thing that's sought. Justice and truth, not partiality, not trying to make people, not trying to get on someone's good side. From there, we get to verse 10. In verse 10 and following, he's going to change to talking about religious laws. These are mostly laws and ideas that revolve around the commandment of remember the Sabbath day. And again, not just the Sabbath day, but the Sabbath year. Verse 10, for 6 years you shall sow your land and gather in its yield. But the 7th year you shall let it rest and lie fallow, that the poor of your people may eat. And what you leave the beasts, and what they leave, the beasts of the field may eat. You shall do likewise with your vineyard and with your olive orchard. Now, this is a very interesting thing, and this is something I've always wondered about, because God calls these people to work their land, work their farm. When they get to the promised land, work the field for 6 years. And in the 7th year, don't work. Now, part of me says, hey, that'd be great. I can't imagine if our government said that. Said, okay, to keep everybody from wearing out and from wearing out all the machines at our factory or wearing out all things, wherever it is you work, here's what's going to happen. You work for 6 years. The 7th year, we're going to take a break. You're not going to go into your factory. You're not going to go into your office. You're going to get a year off. And again, you'd do other things that year because there's a lot more to do. But as far as that job, that job of your factory or your playing field, you're not going to do that. I think back to that and say, I think I like this law. But this law would have been a very major step for these people to do, because a lot of people ask the question, and we have to think about it this way of, well, if we do this, what about food for that 7th year? How are we going to survive if we're not supposed to plant, we're not supposed to harvest, not supposed to do any of the things we always do? What are we going to do? What this would teach them to do is to teach them to rely on God. And it reminds me of what God called the Israelites to do in the wilderness. And remember, some of them did it, some of them didn't. When the manna fell, remember he told them for 6 days you're to gather manna. On the 7th, or on the 6th day, gathered twice as much manna for the 7th. You remember that there was people that gathered more than they were supposed to the manna and didn't obey God like he told them to. And they tried God. And God said on the 7th day, the Sabbath day, there's not going to be any manna. And they still went out and tried to find manna. Some of them did, and there was no manna there. The idea is, what most Bible scholars think is that's the same idea here, is that God tells Israel, what I'm going to do is on the 6th year, you're going to get a bumper crop. What we call bumper crop, an abundant crop, a crop that's going to give you enough food to not just feed you the 6th year, but also feed you into the 7th year and into the 8th year until you start harvesting your plants again. And so God says you're going to be taken care of, and that's the promise that they're going to have what they need. And God says just let it rest. If something grows, that's fine. If you have a wheat field and a wheat grows that 7th year, let it go. What you're going to do is you're going to let the poor. Now, again, this is interesting. Very key thing that God does. God takes care of his poor, but the poor don't just sit back. It's not that you're going to go to your field, you're going to harvest that wheat that grew the year it wasn't supposed to, and you're going to take that to the poor. No, the poor can come to your field and they can harvest it that year. They can come into your field, they can harvest, and there's certain spots that they were left to harvest for the poor. God took care of the poor, but God didn't let the poor not do anything. They had a part to do as well, meaning they not only had to harvest it, they had to crush the grain, they had to separate, they had to do a winnowing fork and separate the grain from the chaff. Then they had to grind the grain. There was a lot involved in this. And again, this is a very interesting and very amazing system to me to see just how much God thought about it, in that God set these very things up. And again, these are little bitty things that we may think about, but God set them up so that we can know exactly what he expects his people to do. And then he says, whatever the poor don't eat, he said, let the beasts of the field have. Let the animals eat it. They can eat it as they want. And then on the 8th year, you go back, you plow it, and you start planting again. And God says, you're not even supposed to do this with your field. You're also supposed to do this with your vineyard and your olive orchard. Everything you've got, you're supposed to do this with. And God sets up the idea of a Sabbath year that's supposed to help the ground and help the land refurnish. And this is interesting because we see that today, don't we? I don't know if you've talked to farmers now, but it's amazing how certain companies and farmers are learning, and again, they've known this for years, to either alternate crops or let their fields have a year of rest, have a season of rest, to let it to let it get the nutrients back, because it helps them have a better crop in years to come. And this was a plan God had, but God promised, and the idea here, God told them to do this, tells us that God has promised these people that if they do this, he would take care of them. If they do this, then he would ensure that they were taken care of in the year to come. Now, again, God pays attention to the Sabbath day. 6 days you shall do no work, but on the 7th day you shall rest, that your ox and your donkey may have rest, and the son of your servant woman and the alien may be refreshed. Pay attention to all that I've said to you, and make no mention of the name of the other gods, nor let it be heard on your lips. Now, verse 12, he lays out the Sabbath day again. Now, notice again God's care. We talked earlier about the care for animals. Did you catch what he said here? On 6 days you do your work. The 7th you shall rest. Your animal shall rest, and your servant shall rest, and the alien, the foreigner, shall rest. Everyone that is present, everyone that is here shall have a time of rest, shall have a time to refresh. God, again, not only took care of the people, he took care of the slaves, he took care of the people who weren't originally from there, but he also took care of the animals. And again, notice what we said before. The beginning of the Sabbath day was not tied to a day of worship, except certain feast days. The Sabbath was simply a day of rest, a day when they were to stop and they were to not work on that day. And then you notice what he says in verse 13. He says, pay attention, look to what you're doing, and make sure that you don't mention the other gods. And the idea is not to mention them, but don't mention them in your oaths. Don't mention them in your plans and what you say you're going to do. And again, they would say, may God do this to me if I don't fulfill this promise. And they would use the name of false gods or idols or another god. And God says, don't do that. When if you make an oath, make it in according to my name, because my name will stand and my name will be true. So God is wanting them to make sure they're a pure, holy people. Then he lays out verse 14 to verse 17 about feasts. There were 3 major feasts the Israelites were to keep. Notice, 3 times in a year you shall keep a feast to me. You shall keep the feast of the unleavened bread, as I commanded you. You shall eat unleavened bread for 7 days at the appointed time in the month of Aviv. For in it you came out of Egypt. None shall appear before me empty-handed. You shall keep the feast of harvest, of the first fruits of your labor, of what you sow in the field. You shall keep the feast of ingathering at the end of the year, when you gather in from the field the fruit of your labor. 3 times in a year shall all your males appear before the Lord God. What this lays out a precedent for what God's going to require these people. And that is that 3 times a year, all the Jewish males were commanded to come to Jerusalem. Now, eventually they stopped doing this as they began to be spread throughout the world, and some weren't able to make this trip. But this is what God called them to do. When God chose Jerusalem, this was the point, that 3 times a year you were to come here. And remember, that's one of the problems Israel has. When Israel and Judah separates later, is Israel says, hey, we can't, the northern kingdom, they say, we can't tell everybody to go back to Jerusalem, because if they go back to Jerusalem, they may feel sympathy and they may want to rejoin. So we've got to make our own places. But this is what God's plan was from the beginning, was they were supposed to every year go to Jerusalem, and they were to have these feasts. Now let's talk about these three feasts. We're going to go a slide ahead, where I'm going to break these feasts off and give you some alternate names for these feasts. The three major feasts that are given there, the first is the Feast of Unleavened Bread, which began with Passover. This was the first major feast of the year. It was the first month of their new year. And in our calendar, again, remember, they used a lunar calendar, not a solar calendar, so their days don't line up exactly like ours does. But this would have been mid-March to mid-April. So middle March, what we consider about a month, is when this feast would have fallen. And remember, on this feast, they were to eat unleavened bread for 7 days to remember the time when they were wandering in the wilderness, where they were unable to put the leaven in their bread and have time for the bread to rise. They had to eat in such a hurry. And so Moses tells them, or God tells them, to not eat unleavened bread for 7 days. Now, what's interesting about this is that all three of these feasts ties to a harvest. Now, we may look at some of them, and you see the Feast of Harvest, the next one, and the Feast of Ingathering. We see that. But the Feast of Unleavened Bread was also a harvest. This was the barley harvest. This was a time when they would harvest their barley. And this is why, if you go back to verse 15, when God says, none shall appear before me empty-handed. Basically, what he's saying is, when you come for the Feast of Passover, when you come for the Feast of Unleavened Bread, bring the barley with you, bring your first fruits, bring your good harvest when you come down to offer to me. And again, these were offerings that were made to the priest. These were made to the priest to sustain them. This was how they survived. It was made to God, but the priest took it. They would also offer sometimes the unleavened bread. They would cook loaves of bread and it would be given to the priest, and the priest would eat it. And so this was the first one. This is why God says, don't come empty-handed. The second one is one that we may not recognize as much by that, and by two of its names, but one of them we will. And that is the Feast of Harvest, or the Feast of Weeks, or what's later called in the New Testament, Pentecost. It's called Pentecost because it comes from Pente, because that's a Greek word for 50. What happens is the Feast of Harvest is 50 days after the Passover. After Passover, first day of the Feast of Unleavened Bread, 50 days later comes the Feast of Harvest. And this was a time that was mid-March, or mid-May, to mid-June. Mid-May to mid-June, they would come and they'd bring the harvest of wheat. And they would come and they'd bring the first fruits. And again, this is very interesting. God laid out for them, you're to bring the first fruits, that first harvest. And this harvest, the first fruits of the harvest, would not go to you, wasn't go to storage. It was come straight to God. That God was one you're supposed to offer this to. And again, don't come to me empty-handed. Then the third one, what happens eventually, I'll tell you about this. The first two, what would happen in some cases is that if you journey from a long way, such as Galilee or somewhere that you were, took you a few days to get to Jerusalem, what a lot of people would do is they would come for Passover. They would prepare to stay over. They would stay the 50 days. They'd stay the 2.5 months from Passover to the Feast of Pentecost. And they would stay in Jerusalem for those 50 days, those 2 months, and then they'd go back home, because it didn't make a whole lot of sense to come down for a month, make a few day travel, be there for a week for the Feast of Passover, take a few days to a week traveling back, work for a week or two, have to travel another few days to a week to get back to Jerusalem, have another week-long feast, and then go have a few more days to a week going back. So they would plan to stay there the entire time. And they would bring their harvest. Now, those who live nearby would bring the harvest with them. They'd bring the first fruits. And those from other areas will sometimes have people bring their harvest to them. But it depends on what they would do, of how they would keep this feast. The last one is what's called the Feast of Ingathering. This is when they gathered their fruit. They gathered from their vineyards, their olive orchards, and so forth and so on. Now, this one would later have a change of name, or have an additional name that we may recognize more. And this is the Feast of Booths, or the Feast of Tabernacles. And what this feast was, this is when everybody was coming to Jerusalem, and later on, when they did this feast like God told them to, especially New Testament, they would come and they would set up tents. That was the idea of booths. They set up booths to live in, or tabernacles. That's another word for tent. And what they would do is they'd live in these tents to remember the 40 years of wandering. They would remember the time that they were wandering in the wilderness, and they'd have a 7-day feast to it. And in this feast, they would bring the first fruits of their harvest. They'd bring the fruit harvest. They would bring the best from their orchards, from their olive. And again, what they would do is they would bring this to the priest as an offering to God, and this is what the priest would live on. And so God says a very interesting system here. And that God's people, God's priests, are taken care of by the sacrifices of the people. And so this is a very key thing, that the people depended on how faithful the priest depended on how faithful the people were. I apologize. And so those are the three major feasts. Verse 18 and following, God's going to sort of lay out some more commands for that feast. You shall not offer the blood of my sacrifice with anything leavened, or let the fat of my feast remain until the morning. The best of the first fruits of your ground you shall bring into the house of the Lord your God. You shall not boil a young goat in its mother's milk. And so what happens here is God lays out some more commands of what they're supposed to do. Again, notice, don't offer the blood of my sacrifice with anything leavened. Don't mix the blood in the leaven. Don't mix the blood in the bread. Now, the idea here, we think, is what this is. It's the leaven is sometimes used as something that affects something. It's sometimes viewed spiritually as being unclean or impure, that the leaven, Paul will talk about the leavens the whole lump. That's sort of the idea that we think that he means here, is don't mix the leaven with the blood, and keep these two sacrifices separated. Again, this is very key, because this would have been something they did in the pagan cultures, but in God's commands, the blood and the meat will be offered in one place on the altar on the altar outside. But if you had anything leavened, it was a cooked bread, it would be offered to the priest, and the priest would be able to eat it. So these were not supposed to be mixed. The blood was to be poured out, the bread was to be eaten. And so this is what the idea of here is. And then the fat of my feast remained till morning. The fat is, they were told not to eat the fat, not to eat the blood or the fat. And the fat was to be burned immediately to God. And so here's the idea of when you offer a sacrifice, one of the first things you need to do is you burn the fat. You don't let the fat sit there. You don't let and again, that was the idea of a best part of the animal. You don't let it sit there. You burn it, you destroy it. And then again, notice, the best of the first fruits of your ground shall you bring into the house of the Lord your God. Again, this is their offering. They brought it to the priest, and the priests were to take that and see what they gave. And then the priests were to divide that up among themselves. That was going to be their food. And then the last one is an interesting one, because we really don't know exactly what this is exactly about. Some people think this is probably tied to a Canaanite practice, a pagan practice, that they would sometimes boil a young goat in its mother's milk. They would boil this meat, and they would offer it to their God, or they would eat it, and God condemns this. Again, while we're not sure, some people have taken this pretty far. Even some Jews today take this command of don't boil a mother's milk, a baby goat in its mother's milk. I didn't notice, I was reading today about it. They would take it as far as to say that you can't, in the same refrigerator, again, modern day, in the same refrigerator, you can't have meat and cheese, or meat and dairy. They have two different refrigerators. One has meat in it, the other has dairy. And they would even go as far to say that you cannot have a meal where you eat dairy and meat at the same time. I thought about that, and I was like, I don't know if I could do that. And again, whenever I think about that, I think about how much we mix those two. How many meals do we put cheese on or cheese in? And if that was what God, and the way they interpret this law was that you can't combine those two. But again, there's no foundation that says that's what God means here. God is setting forth a practice that the Canaanites did, and some people think this was tied to maybe fertility or tied to a certain worship of God. And God says, don't be like them, don't act like them, don't offer it this way. But it's one of the prohibitions of how they're not supposed to offer things to God. Then God goes in verse 20 through verse 33 to lay out the end of this covenant, to lay out what God's going to do and what they need to do. Verse 20, behold, I'll send an angel before you to guard you on the way and to bring you to the place that I have prepared. Pay careful attention to him, obey his voice, and do not rebel. Oh, sorry. Do not rebel against him, for he will not pardon you your transgression. My name is in him. But if you carefully obey his voice and do all that I say, then I will be an enemy to your enemies and an adversary to your adversaries. So again, God says he's going to send an angel before them, a messenger. Again, what is this messenger? We don't know. It could be a human messenger. Just some people believe this is talking about Moses and talking about Joshua. That's possible. The only problem with that is this last part of verse 21, where it talks about he can pardon your transgression and my name is in him. And we know the shortcomings of Moses, and we know Joshua being man would have shortcomings. Other people take this to be a literal angel and a heavenly being, and that, again, that's possible. But the problem with it again is the pardoning your transgression, and my name is in him. Some people take this to be the pre-incarnate word, the angel of the Lord. They'll take the word of the angel of the Lord, and the special angel being Jesus before he came flesh. Again, there's no real way that we could give an answer of any of these. However, that last one fits all these qualifications in that Jesus, before he became flesh, would have been able to pardon transgression, pardon sin. God's name would have been in him, in that he was separate from God, but yet he still had God's power. But we really just don't know what this angel is that God sends. But what God does tell them is that he's going to do things. And when he comes to you, listen to him. Listen to what he says. Obey his voice, because obeying him is going to be equal to obeying God. And that's another interpretation here, is the idea of this angel of God, sort of like the fiery the burning bush in Exodus 3, is God's manifestation on earth. And maybe that's what it is. Again, any of those four options can work. None of them really, we're not told exactly in detail which one of those it is, and we really don't need to know. But God lays out this plan that there's this angel that's going to be with him as God, and he's going to be a messenger for God. Listen to him, and you'll be delivered. And then God says, if you obey his voice, you listen to what the angel says, he says, I'll be an enemy to your enemies. I'll take care of you. I will protect you as I promised. If you don't, however, then you're going to suffer. And so Moses and the people are called to listen to what God says. Verse 23, when my angel goes before you and brings you to the Amorites, the Hittites, and the Perizzites, and the Canaanites, the Hivites, and the Jebusites, and I'll blot them out. You shall not bow to their gods, nor serve them, nor do as they do, but you shall utterly overthrow them and break their pillars in pieces. You shall serve the Lord your God, and he will bless your bread and your water, and I will take sickness from among you. None shall miscarry or be barren in your land. I will fulfill the number of your days. I will send my terror before you and will throw into confusion all the people against whom you shall come. And I will make all your enemies turn their backs to you. And I will send hornets before you, which shall drive out the Hivites, the Canaanites, the Hittites, and before you. I will not drive them out before you in 1 year, lest the land become desolate and the wild beasts multiply against you. Little by little, I will drive them out from before you until I have increased and possessed the land, until you have increased and possessed the land. And I will set your border from the Red Sea to the Sea of the Philistines, from the wilderness to the Euphrates, for I will give the inhabitants of the land into your hand, and you shall drive them out before you. You shall make no covenant with them and their gods. They shall not dwell in your land, lest they make you sin against me. For if you serve their gods, it will surely be a snare to you. So let's notice what God says here real quick. God says this angel is going to lead them into the promised land. And he's going to lead them into the land. These are the people. And he says, as you go into their land, I'm going to blot them out. I'm going to remove them. They're not going to be there anymore. And he gives a warning. And this section is right with this warning of what God says. Listen, when you go into that promised land, when you enter that land I'm going to give you, he says there's some things you got to do. He says, one, don't bow to their gods. Don't turn over and worship their gods. Don't serve them. Don't bow down to them. Don't do like they do. Don't act like the pagans. He says, but instead you shall utterly overthrow them. You shall utterly defeat them. You shall break their pillars. The idea of these pillars here were pillars that were built as an idol to worship their God. He says, tear those down. And again, he says, you shall serve the Lord your God. And he tells them, if you serve me, he says, I'll bless you. I'll bless your food. I'll bless your water. I will take sickness away from you. You won't have to worry about any of these things. He even says you should not miscarry or be barren. He says, I will fulfill the number of days. You're going to live a long life if you will listen to me. Then verse 27 and 28, he talks about it, and 27 to 29, he talks about driving them out. Again, he tells them, you're not going to have to do the fighting. I'm going to drive the people out before you. Again, he's going to send the terror before them. Well, what is this terror? Well, this terror apparently is news about what they're doing. And we see this come to fruition in Joshua. You know, when the two spies go into Jericho and they meet Rahab, remember what Rahab says? Rahab says, we heard what you did in Egypt. We heard what you did before. We heard what happened earlier. And we're afraid. We're worried that you're going to come do that to us. And God says this terror is going to go before you. And then verse 28, the hornets are going to come. Now, exactly what the hornets are, again, we don't know. Some people think it may be literal hornets, possibly. The word here for hornets is used very few times in the Old Testament, but it's also used to describe chaos, to describe fear. So it could be the very same thing. It's a terror, just another way of wording this. But no matter what, God says, I'm going to drive the inhabitants out in front of you. You don't have to worry about them. And then the interesting thing about this verse 29 is God says, when I drive them out, I'm not going to just come in and we're going to drive everybody out of the land in one day, in 1 year. He said, instead, where fields are going to be grown over, those houses are going to be crumbling to pieces. It's not going to be worth anything. The idea is these people are going to come in, they're going to eliminate the people who live in an area, then they're going to take over their houses, they're going to take over their fields, they're going to basically inherit a home and field that is working, that is growing, that is developing. And so God says you're going to go in and you're going to take it little by little. Until you have increased in possession land, I'm going to go with you. And he says that here, he says, verse 31 is very interesting. He sets the borders of the promised land. He says, I'll set your border from the Red Sea down in Egypt, near Egypt, all the way to the Sea of the Philistines. This is the Mediterranean Sea, all the way up to the wilderness and all the way to the Euphrates. Euphrates is that great river near Babylon. The idea is they're going to have this huge swath of land if they're faithful. Now, what's interesting about this is only during the time of David and Solomon that the kingdom of Israel reaches these full potential, reaches these borders. For the rest of the time, for the hundreds of years besides when David and Solomon reigned, their territory is very small. But God says, if you'll obey me, you'd have all this. Well, you get the answer there. If you know the story, you know what's going to happen. They're not going to obey God. They're not going to follow God. They're going to do exactly what God told them to do. Therefore, they never get the full promise. And then God says again, I will give you the inhabitants of the land into your hand. You will drive them out, and you shall drive them out before you. And the people don't drive them out. We see verse 32 and 33. Why God says this? Well, one, he says, don't make covenants with them and their gods. When you make a covenant with someone, you had to swear on a God. God knows that if these Canaanites come in and they make covenants with them, the Canaanites are going to want to swear by their God. And their gods are useless. Their gods are demons. Their gods are not real gods. And therefore, the Israelites can be tempted to turn to those gods. God says, no, don't make a covenant with them. And then on that, he says, don't dwell with them. Don't let them dwell in your land because they will make you sin. And this is something we see over and over throughout Israel's history. The people around Israel learned how to make them fall, and that was to get them to follow a false god. And if they followed a false god, God wouldn't be with them. And this is what God told them before they ever got to the promised land. If you'll serve me and follow me and me only, I'll bless you and you'll be a great people. If not, you're going to sin against me. And then you notice that last part, if you serve other gods, it shall surely be a snare to you. You'll surely fall. And that's the problem we see in Israel is they don't believe God. Now, God gives them plenty of time to turn. God gives them plenty of time to make it right, but they don't do it. They don't follow God's command. They don't drive out all the people. They don't tear down all the idols. They don't refuse to make covenants. And all these things they do causes them to fall further and further away from God. And these were very things God told them from the beginning, do not do. If you'll not do this, you'll be blessed. If you don't serve, if you don't turn against me, if you'll follow me and obey me, you'll have the greatest things you can ever have. If you don't obey me, if you don't follow me, then you're going to be cursed. You're going to have a downfall. So that's Exodus 24. Or 23, excuse me. Next week we get in 24. Exodus 24 is where the people ratify the covenant. The elders come and have a meal with God. Very interesting chapter. I can't wait to study 24. 24 has always been a very interesting chapter to me. But we'll talk about that next week. I appreciate you joining us here tonight. Appreciate you tuning in. We're thankful for the ability to have this. Don't forget, Sunday morning we have our service at 10 o'clock. If you're able to be there, we'd love to have you. If not, you can find us online. Appreciate everyone again joining us here tonight. not, we hope that you're having a good week. I hope everything's doing well for you. I hope you're enjoying this warmer weather versus the cold weather we had last week. But until we have our next thing together, we appreciate everyone's attention, appreciate everyone being here. We hope to see you all real soon. And again, we hope that God's blessing you in all